The first year she was eligible for the Georgia Women of Achievement Award, we believed that she was most appropriate to be honored for this, to recognize all that she did in the state of Georgia.
Frances Freeborn Pauley was a Georgia activist and dynamic leader in social and political movements at the state and national level throughout much of the 20th century. From the 1930s to the 1990s, her commitments to public education, health and welfare, civil rights, and the needs of the poor lay at the heart of her advocacy. Pauley never held a political office, but as an activist, she found ways to address the needs of all citizens.
She was originally born in Ohio, but like a lot of people, her parents moved to Georgia when she was about 3 years old. She attended Agnes Scott when she graduated from high school. She was honored by Agnes Scott as a distinguished alumni, so she's very much a Georgian and certainly would identify herself that way.
She learned a lot from her mother, who had come up in the Methodist Church in the South. The phrase of the time was the church as exhibiting the social gospel, wanting to make a difference in the world and improve the world. So religion with at least a bit of a beginning of an activist bent to it.
Frances married William Pauley on May 25, 1930, and the couple had 2 daughters. With young children, Pauley found the time to start a school lunch program through the Junior Service League, as well as organize a public health clinic, DeKalb Clinic. These 2 resources met the basic needs of local citizens during the Great Depression.
She herself said that it was really the Great Depression that triggered more of her activism. By that time she was married, she had 2 children, and during the Great Depression she witnessed how important the role of government was during the Great Depression because her husband received some assistance through the New Deal. She also became involved in a public health clinic in DeKalb County, and this clinic provided a lot of assistance for people in low income. It wasn't necessarily African Americans, it was for the poor.
I tend to date the beginnings of her organizing career, political organizing, activist career, whatever you want to call it. I tend to date that from the Great Depression era. And it was really seeing the additional misery that was caused for poor people, white as well as black, in the metropolitan Atlanta area during the Great Depression. That was the radicalizing experience for her, as it was for many, many people.
So after the Great Depression, once we get to World War II, Frances Pauley becomes affiliated with the League of Women Voters. They don't affiliate with a specific political party. And in the case of Georgia, what they did was champion a couple issues, primarily an issue in the 1950s known as the county unit system.
On the eve of the modern civil rights movement, the League took a stand for the principle of one person, one vote, a principle that Pauley would work hard for throughout her public career.
So the League of Women Voters in Georgia decided to take this on, and Frances Pauley was at the forefront of this.
In 1947, Pauley became the president of the DeKalb League and pushed it beyond its opposition to the county unit system. Pauley's leadership became even more crucial as she was named Georgia League president at the time of the United States Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, which called for the desegregation of public schools.
When the movement was at its strongest in the 1960s, she was at that point in her 60s. There's really only a handful who were as deeply committed to community level work as she was. And so I'd say that that stands out. And then I think the other thing that stands out for me is her commitment to not only trying to help poor people get out of poverty and what we would now call empowerment, but also believing that poor people were every bit as much citizens. There's a lot of people who believe in social services and helping the poor, but she was really as much about equal political participation for the poor.
Across the state, Hope held public meetings and petition drives to chart a course away from the resistance to Brown v. Board of Education.
Pauley and this group of reformers decide that they're going to focus this hope campaign. They're going to frame it by saying it's more important to save public education for our children rather than favor segregation. And that's how they frame the campaign. Let's look at this in a different way. And they're successful in Georgia. And it's very important because Georgia does not close the schools.
In 1962, Georgia became a state in which each citizen's vote counted. And by 1963, Georgia counties slowly moved toward desegregating public schools.
This is a quote from her that I wanted to read. Time after time, town after town that I went into, it would be the first interracial meeting that they had ever had. Unless you decided you are going to break the law and have civil disobedience, which I highly approve of, you had to plan it and do it. It's not just a matter of casually asking a few people in for tea. So she became active in that work, and then in one of the biggest civil rights campaigns in Georgia.
The two things I would want to emphasize: the longevity of her career and her belief that change is possible. It's incumbent on all of us to believe it's possible, and if we do, we can do something about problems that seem intractable.
She doesn't do this because she needs the money. So this is a lot of voluntary activism she does, which would have been more acceptable for a woman of her time.
During the 1960s, Pauley deepened her commitment to interracial activism and civil rights when she served as the executive director of the Georgia Council on Human Relations, the state branch of the Southern Regional Council. With this job, her first paid and professional position, Pauley brought races together in towns across Georgia, seeking to build support for the goals of the civil rights movement.
How many women really worked at that level of reform, let alone at a voluntary level? To go down to Albany, Georgia and work in a desegregation campaign that was very unpopular, or to help keep schools open. People might think those things privately, but not every white person, let alone white woman, did it.
I think she would say that there were times she was afraid, but not to a point that it stopped her from participating at a level that made her comfortable. I met her and interviewed her for my dissertation, and after I finished that project, I just realized that her particular story had stuck with me, and so I contacted her and suggested that we do a life history interview. A few years later, that turned into the book project. But then in the end, she couldn't read it. It had to be read back to her, so it was in her own voice. I was pretty nervous about what she would think about it, even though she'd been very involved in it. But still, there it was, And so I asked her at the end, I got up on a gumption and said, "What did she think?" She says, "Yeah, I think it's pretty good."